of Pichinus and then veered westwards, heading to Cape Ecnomus. Polybius states that the Roman land forces happened to be just in that neighborhood. Presumably, one or more legions were due to embark in preparation for the invasion. Unbeknownst to the Romans, the Carthaginians headquartered at Panormus became aware of the plan and rallied an even larger fleet, numbering 350 vessels manned by 150,000 sailors, which is roughly the entire population of modern Tallahassee, Florida. Their combined force left Panormus, stopped at Lilybaeum, and then dropped anchor at Heraclea Manoa. From their anchorage at Cape Ecnomus, the Romans prepared themselves for the crossing towards northern Africa. The consuls in charge, Marcus Atilius, Regulus, and Lucius Manlius, knew that their ships were slower and less maneuverable than their enemies. Thus, they conceived a formation to provide maximum protection for both the vessels and the cargo. They stationed their own enormous hexagon galleys at the very front, each to be followed by one squadron, following a diagonal line. This gave the formation the appearance of a large wedge. The consuls then placed a third squadron at the base of the wedge, thus closing a triangle. This squadron was also in charge of towing the transport ships, vital for the invasion's success. Finally, a fourth squadron of vessels, described by Polybius as triarii, closed the formation, arranged in a line behind the transports. Back in Heraclea, the Carthaginians were steadying themselves for a major battle in the open waters. Their leaders, Generals Hamilcar and Hanno, addressed their forces, stressing the importance of a victory. If they emerged triumphant, they could aim at retaking Sicily. If they lost, they were bound to fight for the very existence of their homeland. With their spirits galvanized, the Carthaginians sailed eastwards, ready to quash the Roman invasion in its inception. When Hamilcar and Hanno came into view of the Roman fleet, they gave dispositions for their squadrons to attempt an maneuver. 3/4 of their vessels arranged themselves in a single line, their bows facing the Romans. Their southernmost squadron, led by Hanno, extended to the open sea, ready to pivot in a pincer movement. The northernmost squadron, under Hamilcar, was slanted at an angle towards the coast, ready to close the pincer from the north. Regulus and Manlius took notice of the incoming enemies and of how thin and extended their main line of battle was. Aiming to break the center of their formation, the consuls ordered for their two squadrons to row forward at speed. The Carthaginian ships immediately retreated westwards, prompting the enthusiastic Romans to charge even faster. However, this Carthaginian withdrawal was part of Hamilcar's plan to extend and eventually break apart the Roman formation, a plan which worked perfectly when the Roman rear squadrons and the transports were left isolated at the rear. When the Carthaginian center had drawn off the consuls' squadrons far enough, Hamilcar released a signal from his ship. The Carthaginian galleys all turned simultaneously and charged back at their pursuers. A colossal naval melee ensued as each faction fought how they knew best. The Carthaginians outmaneuvered and outflanked the Roman ships, ramming into their sides with their rostra before quickly disengaging and taking on the next target. On the other hand, the Romans made good use of their corvus, the lethal mobile bridge fitted with an iron beak. Once a dropping corvus hooked a Carthaginian ship. The Roman marines swiftly crossed the bridge, disposing of the enemy crew. Regulus and Manlius also actively stormed enemy ships and incited their men to fight with more vigor. At the same time, Hanno's squadron had swung northwards as intended and was facing the fourth Roman squadron or triarii, gaining the upper hand. Further north, the Carthaginian squadron closer to the coast had pivoted southwards, falling upon the third Roman squadron. To increase their speed, the latter vessels let go of the ropes, towing the transport ships, which remained stranded. Amidst the three separate engagements raging around them, the main fight pitched the consuls against Hamilcar and was initially evenly matched, but the Romans had an advantage. Their fleet had been conceived as a landing expedition. Therefore, they fielded more heavy infantry compared to the Carthaginians, which gave them the edge in close-quarter fights. Eventually, Regulus and Manlius' forces had the upper hand, and Hamilcar ordered his ships to disengage and sail westwards. Manlius' squadron then rounded up several enemy ships as prizes, whilst Regulus ordered for his vessels to row east, going to the aid of the triarii and the transport ships. Regulus' squadron veered north, thus attacking Hanno's squadron from the rear. The morale of the triarii was boosted by the sight of the consular ship and went on the attack. Hanno was now crushed between two lines of ships and narrowly escaped to the open sea. This left only one Carthaginian squadron on the waters of Ecnomus. This division was closer to the coast, which had engaged the Roman third squadron, pushing it closer and closer to the shoreline. The Carthaginians, however, did not attempt decisive ramming action, as they had observed the effectiveness of the corvi at closed ranges. This allowed Regulus and Manlius to close in on the enemy from two separate directions, thus forming a perfect encirclement. Only a handful of Carthaginian ships managed to escape the three-pronged attack, while 50 vessels and their crews fell into the hands of the Romans. The largest naval battle in antiquity had come to an end, with a clear Roman victory. In total, 680 warships had been deployed by both sides, manned by almost 300,000 men. Rome had captured a total of 64 galleys and sunk more than 30, thus eliminating almost one-third of Hamilcar's and Hanno's fleet. The consuls had lost 24 ships sunk and none captured. The bulk of the invasion force was intact, and there would be no obstacles from Ecnomus to North Africa. The invading force, under Regulus and Manlius, swiftly sailed across the Mediterranean, landing at the Hermian promontory at the northeastern end of the Bay of Carthage. From there, the Roman legions proceeded south, towards the city of Aspis, which they took after a short siege. Meanwhile, what remained of the Carthaginian fleet had returned to their home city to warn the local ruling Senate, as the Romans were expected to attack immediately. The capital's defenses were strengthened. But Regulus and Manlius had other plans. In the days following the conquest of Aspis, their soldiers systematically plundered its rich and fertile lands. The Romans drove vast herds of cattle into their camp, ransacked farms and palaces before setting them on fire, and finally abducted 20,000 inhabitants of the countryside to be sold into slavery. This wealth accumulation may have prompted the Roman Senate to issue an unexpected order. Lucius Manlius would return immediately to Rome with the war booty. Regulus would be left in charge of operations in the Carthaginian territory with 40 ships, 500 horsemen, and 15,000 soldiers. Shortly after Manlius' departure, General Hamilcar returned to his homeland with 500 cavalry and 5,000 foot. In consultation with the other two generals, Hasdrubal and Boestar, he resolved to crush the Roman threat. But Regulus maintained the initiative. From Aspis he marched his soldiers some 100 kilometers to the east and prepared to attack the city of Adis, the antechamber to Carthage and its bay. The Romans surrounded Adis with their siege works and raided the countryside for supplies. Seeing an opportunity to target their foraging parties, the three Carthaginian generals deployed their own army near the besieged city. Numerically, their forces were roughly equal to the Romans, but the locals could boast two advantages: a highly skilled light cavalry and a detachment of war elephants. Both assets would have seriously harmed the Romans if deployed on an open flat terrain. Unfortunately, Hamilcar, Hasdrubal, and Boestar decided to concentrate their force on the top of a rocky hill. This tactical blunder was not lost on Regulus, who attacked the hill before the elephants and cavalry could leave their camp. In the early hours of the day, two columns left the Roman camp, approaching the Carthaginian hill from opposing sides. When the defenders took notice, the Romans were already marching up the hill, too late to unleash the horses and elephants. The camp's defense was left to mercenary infantry, who staged a gallant sortie, charging downhill at one of the Roman columns. The legionnaires were forced into a hasty retreat, and the Carthaginian mercenaries chased them all the way to the plain. But in doing so, they overstretched their lines. The second Roman column took advantage and attacked the mercenaries from the rear, routing them for good. Both Roman columns then reprised their ascent of the hill, closing in on the Carthaginian camp. Behind the palisades, the trio of generals realized that their men had suffered a breakdown in morale and that resistance would have been futile. By the time Regulus reached the top of the hills, his adversaries had already begun to disengage. The elephants and the cavalry cautiously descended onto the level ground and then retreated at speed, followed by the infantry. Regulus' legion gave chase but soon desisted, preferring to indulge in a more pleasant pursuit, plundering booty. The Romans ransacked the Carthaginian camp, dismantled their trenches, and then overrun the entire region. Adis and other towns fell quickly. Amongst his conquests, Regulus chose Tunes as his base of operations. This city was a mere 4 hours' march away from Carthage, and made for a perfect staging point to storm or besiege the capital. According to Polybius, the consul was anxious to achieve a quick victory, as his year in charge was ending. He feared that his successor might despoil him of his hard-earned glory. Moreover, Carthage itself was on its knees. Besides the recent military defeats, the Carthaginians had endured Numidian incursions from the west. Thousands of terrified inhabitants had left the countryside to seek refuge behind the walls of Carthage. As a result, famine and disease were widespread within the city, for reasons not specified by Polybius. However, the normally aggressive and reckless Regulus did not move on the attack, but rather tabled talks with the Carthaginians, proposing terms for an armistice. The local Senate accepted to parley in the spring of 255 BC. But the conditions proposed by the consul were simply too harsh. Carthage had to acknowledge Rome's supremacy, form an offensive and defensive alliance with the Republic, give up all of its navy, save for one vessel, cede Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and Lipari, and pay an enormous tribute on top. The Carthaginian Senate rejected these terms, described by Polybius as so dishonorable and so unworthy of their past history. Carthage resolved to fight, but the willingness to give battle was not enough to secure victory. Thus far, the Carthaginian army had been let down by the poor choices of its generals. The Senate realized this and understood that a new commander was needed to set the right strategy and drive the Romans back into the sea. Unlike the Roman army, which relied mainly on citizen soldiers and Italic allies, the Carthaginian infantry was composed mainly of mercenaries. Sometime in 256 or 255 BC, a Carthaginian recruiting agent had been scouting the Mediterranean, seeking to hire the best mercenary troops in the area. During Carthage's darkest hour, with Roman consul Regulus at the gates, the agent returned with a fresh intake of Greek spears for hire. One of them was a Spartan soldier, Xanthippus, a natural commander with a wealth of experience in infantry tactics and strategy. Xanthippus took an interest in the recent defeats suffered by the Carthaginians, assessed their strengths and weaknesses, and formulated a conclusion. Compared to Rome, the Punic army had a much larger and more skilled cavalry, and they had elephants. To make the most of these advantages, Carthage had to seek to encamp and engage the enemy on flat, open terrain. It seems like Xanthippus was particularly adept in the art of stating the obvious. But, according to Polybius, this simple tactical approach had been lost on the trio of Carthaginian commanders, Hamilcar, Hanno, and Boestar. The Carthaginian Senate summoned Xanthippus and asked him to expand on his ideas. The Spartans' sound advice impressed the elites and uplifted the populace's morale. The generals welcomed Xanthippus to their fold and started assembling a new army, ready to take on Regulus in the field. The new force that left Carthage walls consisted of 100 elephants, 4,000 cavalry, and 12,000 foot. The infantry was mostly mercenary, but it also included a militia of 5,000 citizens. The army kept to flat terrain during their march, and encamped on the equally level country, somewhere between the river Bagradas and Tunis. The Roman headquarters. The Romans immediately perceived a change in Carthaginian conduct and were alarmed by the novelty. Nonetheless, the usually aggressive Regulus decided to close the distance with the enemy, setting up a camp about 10 stadia from the enemy. The morning after, the trio of Carthaginian generals sat at a council of war, discussing possible battle formations. Their deliberations were interrupted by the shouts of the soldiers, clamoring for Xanthippus' name and asking to attack immediately. The generals took advantage of the surge in morale, ordered their men to prepare for battle, and then handed over command to the Spartan. Xanthippus acted immediately, issuing his order of battle. The elephants were deployed along a single line at the very front. Behind them, at a small distance, the heavy infantry was laid out in a strong phalanx formation, and at the sides of the elephants, the cavalry guarded the flanks, backed by light infantry. Consul Regulus observed the battle formations and decided to accept the engagement. He marched forward his 15,000 legionaries and 500 equites, and arranged them as per the republican tactics of the era. The light infantry, or veiletes, took up the first line, as per republican custom. Behind them, the maniples were arranged in the three categories of hastati, principes, and triarii. Regulus increased the depth of each line, however, to contrast the momentum of an elephant charge. Finally, the cavalry was split into equal detachments on both sides of the lines. After a tense standoff, Xanthippus gave the order to attack. The elephants advanced towards the veiletes and hastati, while the cavalry rode out to outflank the entire Roman formation. The Romans did not wait for the elephants to hit their line, raising a battle cry and banging their pila on their shields. They, too, charged forward. The Roman cavalry, however, did not stand a chance against the Carthaginian horsemen, who were superior in quantity and quality. The equites on both wings were run over by their foes and were chased off the battlefield. As for the infantry, the maniples on the left wing managed to dodge the impact with the incoming elephants, pressed forward and smashed against a formation of mercenaries on the Carthaginian right wing. Hundreds of mercenaries were cut down, and the survivors ran back to their camp, pursued by the Romans. The center and right wing of Regulus' formation were less successful. They bore the brunt of the elephant charge, thrown into confusion by the sheer mass and crushing stampede of the pachyderms. In the words of Polybius, they were knocked down and trampled upon. They perished in heaps upon the field. The increased depth in Regulus' lines allowed the legions to remain unbroken for a short while, until the cavalry arrived. After routing the equites, the Carthaginian horse returned to outflank and encircled the principes and triarii, picking them off at will. Crushed from all sides, some Roman soldiers managed to force their way through the lines of elephants. Slaloming through their trunks and massive legs, they emerged, exhausted and in loose order, to the other side. That's when second line, the phalanx marched forward and cut them to pieces. Xanthippus had achieved a tactical masterpiece. complete encirclement of the enemy with a force of a similar size. Predictably, 13,000 out of 15,500 legionnaires were massacred on the fields of Bagratus. Consul Regulus somehow succeeded in breaking the encirclement and tried to flee towards Tunis with 500 soldiers in tow, but the enemy cavalry was soon upon them, and all of them were captured. Only 2,000 Romans had escaped death or capture. Those who had smashed through the mercenary lines on the left wing, those 2,000 eventually fled to Aspis, on the promontory east of Carthage. As per Xanthippus, he could boast of having lost only 800 men. Despite his triumph, Xanthippus did not stay at the head of Carthage's armies. Fearing the jealousy of the local generals, he soon embarked homewards. The Carthaginians resumed the fight, willing to wipe out the survivors of Tunis. Now, entrenched in Aspis, the Punic army besieged the city but was frustrated by the courageous resistance of the survivors. Meanwhile, the Roman Senate received news of their plight and started building a new fleet to repatriate them. In turn, the Carthaginians learned about the Roman shipbuilding program and launched one of their own, assembling 200 ships quickly. The Carthaginian fleet patrolled the North African coast, waiting for the Romans to show up. The enemy fleet was finally sighted just off Cape Hermium. The Punic squadrons prepared to give battle, but to their surprise, the Roman fleet was huge. It numbered 350 quirines, dispatched from Italy under the command of consuls Marcus Aemilius and Servius. This fleet was joined by a further 40 vessels moored at Aspis, which sailed out to join the fight. The Carthaginian fleet was surrounded and gradually pushed towards the coast. The Roman vessels approached and lowered their iron-beaked corvi, mobile bridges allowing the infantry to board and neutralize the enemy crew. With these tactics, Aemilius and Fulvius were able to sink 16 vessels and capture 114 ships. Adding them to their already enormous fleet, the Roman galleys safely picked up the survivors at Aspis, as well as all their supplies and booty, and sailed off to Sicily. But it seems as though the Roman navy had run out of favor with Neptune, and perhaps also with Aeolus, ruler of the winds. A mighty storm surprised the fleet off Camarina, on Sicily's southeastern coast. All but 80% of the consul's ships were drowned or driven against the rocks, littering the seaboard with wrecked timber and mangled corpses. According to Polybius, no greater catastrophe is to be found in all history as befalling a fleet at one time. The Greek historian blamed the consuls for the tragedy, as they had ignored the warning of experienced pilots advising against sailing along the southern coast of Sicily. Moreover, they had dared to set sail when the two dangerous constellations, Orion and the Dog Star, were visible. The news of the shipwreck galvanized spirits in Carthage, and the Senate decided to resume operations in Sicily. The command was entrusted to General Hasdrubal, who rallied an unspecified number of soldiers and 140 elephants. The expedition reached the Punic stronghold of Lilybaeum on Sicely's western tip, while Carthage fitted out yet another fleet of 200 ships. Hasdrubal then set out to drill his men and his elephants, preparing them to strike at the Romans on open, flat terrain. Clearly the teachings of Xanthippus had left a mark. Feverish preparations were also taking place in Rome. The Senate of the Republic grieved about the loss of their fleet in their shipwreck, but in typical Roman fashion, they failed to acknowledge the setback and ordered the construction of 220 new vessels. The new squadrons were ready in 3 months, and in 254 BC, they were entrusted to the new consuls, Gnaeus, Cornelius, Scipio, and Aulus Atilius. The fleet sailed to Messana, picking up the survivors of the Camarina shipwreck along the way. Now, 300 ships strong, the Romans sailed to Panormus, the strongest Carthaginian possession in Sicily. The legionnaires disembarked close to the city and laid up their siege works, blockading Panormus from 2 different locations. One division concentrated on the district known as the New Town and its fortifications by the sea. By using a massive battering ram, the Romans knocked down the main defensive tower, thus opening a breach. The legionnaires then poured through the battered walls, taking the new town by storm. The inhabitants of the old town were demoralized by this easy victory and surrendered the entire city to Scipio and Atilius. The consuls had easily taken over Panormus and sailed back to Rome for their triumph, leaving a garrison to hold the city. The following summer of 253 BC, new consuls Gnaeus, Cerealis, and Gaius Sempronius launched a second mission to North Africa. Unlike the earlier expedition, Cerealis and Sempronius did not even attempt to invade Carthaginian territory. Still, they continued sailing along the shore, launching pillaging raids against coastal towns and the countryside. After one of their incursions, the Roman ships ran aground on shallow waters in the Lesser Sirtes and could resume their journey only after throwing overboard all their heavy load. Thus the consuls had to sacrifice most of their loot, and sailed back to Sicily with nothing to show for their efforts. But their spell of bad luck was not over. Upon returning towards Rome, a storm took them by surprise in the Tyrrhenian Sea, destroying more than 150 ships. It appears that nature had succeeded when Carthage couldn't. Contrary to all expectations, the Roman navy had mostly prevailed against its Punic rival in the first years of naval warfare, but in the last 2 years of operations at sea, Carthage had lost 130 ships at the Battle of Cape Hermium, Rome, on the other hand, had suffered the sinking of 534 vessels due to natural disasters, to say nothing of the loss of human life. Taking the crew of a quinquereme as a reference, Rome may have lost up to 220,000 oarsmen, sailors, and marines, a staggering death toll, in addition to the casualties endured in battle, whilst the Roman Republic had reacted with stubbornness. To the first shipwreck, the second disaster dealt a heavy blow to its confidence and finances, to the point that the Senate decided not to launch a new shipbuilding program. Carthage had become master of the seas once again. All that Rome could do was shift their theater of operations back to Sicily, seeking a decisive land victory to dislodge their enemies from the island, finally. In 251 BC, the consuls Lucius Caecilius and Gaius Furius crossed the Straits of Messina with 60 ships, the scant remnants of Rome's once mighty fleet. Their legions marched westwards towards the Carthaginian possessions, but their actions uncharacteristically lacked conviction. The defeat of Xanthippus against Regulus at Tunis left a profound impression on the Roman leadership. Knowing that a force of 140 elephants had landed on Sicily, they would think twice before attempting to challenge the forces of Carthage on an open field. The two consuls' campaign yielded some limited results, with the conquest of Himera after a short siege, but they generally kept their troops safe by moving on mountainous terrain, only sporadically braving an approach towards Lilybaeum and Selinus. Even on those occasions, they did not dare staging an attack. Fearing an elephant charge, the expedition concluded with the recall of Gaius Furius to mainland Italy, accompanied by half of the consular legions. His colleague Caecilius remained on the island, quartering his troops at Palermus. Observing the Romans from Lilybaeum, Carthaginian general Hasdrubal took notice of their reduced numbers and declining morale. This was the time to strike and retake the former Carthaginian capital in Sicily. In the year 251 BC, half of the Roman army, under consul Gaius Furius, was recalled back to mainland Italy, leaving the other consul, Caecilius, in the city of Panormus, a city which had been wrested from Carthaginian control just 3 years. Earlier in 254 BC, when the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal learned of this, he saw an opportunity to deal a crippling blow to the Roman legions, and he brought elephants to a spear fight. Hasdrubal moved out of his headquarters in Lilybaeum and set camp on the border with the territory of Panormus, trying to lure Caecilius into a fight on open terrain. But the crafty consul, wary of the power of elephants on flat territory, did not take the bait, and waited within the city walls. Hasdrubal interpreted this as a sign of cowardice, and boldly marched closer and closer to Panormus, laying waste to the countryside along the way. Once again, Caecilius resisted the temptation to give battle, and waited patiently until the Carthaginians had crossed the Papiritus River. Hasdrubal's troops were now standing between the city walls to the east, and the body of water to the west. It was time to strike. Detachments of Velites, Roman light infantry, sortied out of Panormus, harassing the besiegers and provoking them to attack the city. As Hasdrubal approached the walls with his infantry and the elephants, Caecilius sprung the second part of his trap. Further units of Velites, hidden inside the moat, darted out of their cover to pour volleys of javelins against the attackers. When the elephants charged too close, the light infantrymen simply jumped back into the moat, where they would collect more missiles from heaps laid out by Panormus armorers. Caecilius had effectively neutralized the danger posed by elephants, by denying them what they needed to succeed, masses of people they could trample to death. Meanwhile, the consul assembled his maniples of heavy infantry by the city gate. Opposite the left wing of the Carthaginians, the maniples sallied out of the gate, piecemeal, offering support to the Velites when and where needed. Frustrated by the situation, the Carthaginian officers in charge of the elephants decided to stage a massive charge to distinguish themselves in the eyes of Hasdrubal. The pachyderms thundered forward at once, succeeding in routing the skirmishers and the heavy infantry, but as soon as they got too close to the walls, volleys of arrows and pila turned the mighty pachyderms into giant, ambling pincushions. The elephants panicked, turned around and stampeded across the Carthaginian lines, sowing confusion and flattening their own masters. The bulk of Caecilius' maniples was still fresh and rearing for action. He ordered them to charge into battle, running diagonally into the fragmented Carthaginian lines. The Punic infantry was thoroughly beaten and sent into a precipitous flight. Polybius did not record the number of casualties, but the Greek historian reassures us that Caecilius could herd and capture all the elephants and 10 of their riders. News of the victory was a massive morale booster in Rome. Caecilius had proved that the tusked monsters could be easily dealt with, and thus the Senate agreed to finance the construction of a new fleet, 200 ships strong. The vessels, carrying supplies and fresh troops, landed near the Carthaginian base of Lilybaeum in 250 BC. led by the new consuls Caecilius Regulus and Manlius Fulso. **The Romans laid siege to the city, blockading it by land and sea. Their strategy was to evict the enemy and then bring the fight back to North Africa, which had already been invaded without success. In 256 BC, the Carthaginians realized what was at stake. Eryx, Lilybaeum, and Drepanum were their only possession left in Sicily, and they were ready to defend them at all costs. Lilybaeum was very well fortified, protected by a garrison of 10,000 soldiers, and guarded by high walls and a deep ditch. Moreover, the approach from the harbor was guarded by lagoons, which rendered navigation difficult. Regulus and Vulso nonetheless set up 2 camps to blockade the city, connected by a ditch, stockades, and a wooden wall. They then progressively advanced their siege works towards the tower closest to the shore, and proceeded to batter it with rams. The tower fell, and so did the other 6 standing nearby. The Romans succeeded in damaging or destroying other fortifications almost daily, but the energetic Carthaginian commander, Himilco, was quick in rebuilding them. The Roman efforts were further frustrated by daily and nightly sorties aimed at setting the siege engines on fire. Himilco's successes were almost compromised by some of the mercenary officers in his command. They left Lilybaeum at night and entered the Roman camp, offering to surrender the city. A loyal mercenary leader, Alexon the Achaean, got wind of the plot and reported to Himilco. The general and Alexon addressed the mercenary troops, inciting them to loyalty with promises of additional payment and favors. When the treasonous officers returned to the city, hoping to incite their troops to switch sides, they were instead met by volleys of stones and arrows. Himilco had secured the allegiance of his soldiers, but he still had to feed them. Luckily for him, Carthage had been preparing a relief convoy of 50 ships and 10,000 troops under General Hannibal. No, not that one. No relation to the Barca family. Hannibal's fleet reached the harbor of Lilybaeum, sails flying in a strong gale. Surprisingly, the Roman fleet did not even attempt to stop it, probably taken by surprise or fearful of sailing in such a strong wind. The arrival of Hannibal boosted the morale of the citizens and garrison alike, which Himilco put to good use by organizing a massive sortie. In the early hours of the following morning, he led out his troops, targeting key points in the Roman siege works. But the legionnaires were not taken by surprise this time and fought obstinately. Soon, fighting spread along the battlefront, degenerating into chaotic hand-to-hand combat. Blazing fires engulfed the Romans, rams, and siege engines, but the consul's troops still did not yield, effectively defending their main siege works and causing heavy casualties amongst the Carthaginians. Himilco took notice of the unsustainable losses and eventually ordered his trumpeters to sound a retreat. The siege resumed as before, but Hannibal succeeded once again in braving the naval blockade. This time, he left the harbor of Lilybaeum under the Romans' noses, or rostra, we should say, and sailed to bring reinforcements to Drepanum. This tough decision left Lilybaeum needing a supply fleet, but luckily, help was on its way. Back in Carthage, a nobleman called, guess what? Hannibal the Rhodian offered to run the blockade with his own private vessel to supply Himilco and then report back to the Carthaginian Senate. Once more, the Roman ships guarding the harbor were caught napping as the Rhodian swooshed into port. The enraged consul set up a trap at the exit of the harbor by readying his 10 fastest ships. This time the Rhodian would surely fall. Pray to Rome. He didn't. The next morning, the nobleman's vessel sailed out at speed, oarsmen on full power, leaving the Romans